Most people are aware that the population of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas is predominantly of African descent. And the African diasporic experience in the Bahamas easily can be traced from the pre-Columbian era when they would have come in with Europeans as they come in, and many of them would have stayed. We know that some of them even came on the Columbus's boats. But if we go forward in history, the first real wave of Africans that were brought into these islands really came from Bermuda, 1640s. They would have come in when you had the so-called Bermudan adventurers that migrated to these islands, and they brought with them their slaves. Even after that, there were uprisings, slave uprisings in Bermuda, and there was a decree by the government that all people of African descent, all the free people of African descent, should be banished from the islands. They choose to go to a place called Sikatu. Sikatu, we know, is another name for Eleuthera in the Bahamas. So you would have had waves of people coming here, free people of color coming here to settle from the 1640s, 1650s, 1660s. And the other large wave would have come in the 1780s, like 1783, during the American Revolution. And you would have had thousands, quite frankly, come in not only as slaves, but as free blacks. It was simply because many of these people of African descent came over to the British side, like in Virginia and the Carolinas, etc. And once they came over to the British side, they were given amnesty and were given citizenship and the right to become British subjects. So many of them came in as free people of color. In my era, when you got into a fight, and we got into fights like everybody else, there was something called throwing rocks and perhaps throwing bottles. Guns were non-existent. You could not even think about a gun. But as we move into the 1970s and we got into the drug trade, then attitudes change. Attitudes change primarily because the influence of guns coming in was associated with the drug trade. And young men realized that they didn't necessarily need an education when they can get rich just simply selling drugs. I know stories, because I've traveled to family islands so frequently, I know stories of young men who literally dropped out of school and they're driving a $90,000 BMW and are semi-literate, but because the money is in their pocket. That's the influence. Further to that, what we had in the late 1960s, going more so into the 70s, was a flow of illegal aliens from Haiti. Sadly, most of these people were law-abiding folks. However, among them were members of the Tonton Macoute, fleeing from a changing Haiti. These were people of violence as well, so they brought in that element. But then you had the trade with marijuana coming out of Jamaica, where the level of militancy was incredibly higher than that in these islands. And so the influence, if you combine all of that, really spread. Young men of Haitian descent, in my opinion, many of them felt marginalized. They felt that they were stateless. They needed to identify with something and somebody. And so they formed themselves into gangs or joined gangs so that they could be associated with something that they could call their own, because they could not call themselves Bahamians, did not have passports. And that is still the challenge that we have even today. There are young people that simply are quote unquote stateless. What I found out growing up is that there were gangs that are mostly people from various neighborhoods young men would band themselves together to protect themselves against other groups. I could recall when we would play like softball games against a neighboring group. Well, you will bring out your team to play against that group, but you will also bring with you your support cast in case there was a fight. If there was a fight, then you needed to protect yourself. And so that's how, in my opinion, the gangs emerged. But they became violent in that there was the fight, there was the struggle over money, drugs. And it seemed like that basically has been the major problem. Guns are not something that the Bahamas produces. We don't manufacture weapons at all. But you have very, very fluid borders where anything almost at any time can come in on any vessel, because not only are there the flying vessels, but there are primarily the sailing vessels. And you would have the mega yachts, you'd have the smaller yachts, you'd have the fishing yachts. They will come in under the pretense of just coming in to fish, but a lot of them are engaged in illegal activities as well. And so they may be smuggling guns, let's say down south to Jamaica or Cuba or somewhere, but there is a market in the Bahamas, because the young man in the Bahamas, with his pants hanging partially off his body, period, thinks that to be a man, you have to have a gun, because gun is power. Most of blacks, when they came as slaves, and even when they got their freedom in the 1830s, very late 1830s, they were confined into various communities that were what we call over the hill, i.e. away from Nassau itself, the more urban areas. And they would congregate in those areas, they would live in those areas, and they would be associated by their neighbors, because you were your neighbor keeper back then. But then that began to dissipate when people went on the so-called contract. When they went overseas and they got money, then they moved into new neighborhoods. When they moved into new neighborhoods, they left a vacuum. And into that vacuum came mostly people from the family island, but also those people that were less economically enfranchised. With that, you had a lowering of your standards, a lowering of your class. And so you had people who were really, like we call it in this country, scrapping. They were looking for a way out, because they're looking forward and they're looking at these other neighborhoods. And they're saying, well, why can't I be like X, Y, Z? And then you're going to the public schools, and my friend who lives in this different neighborhood has a different type of lunch than me. Perhaps I may come to school and I don't have any at all. So I need to empower myself financially. So before, young men would have made their money from selling newspapers on the street, daily papers, either mornings and nights, or shining shoes. That fell in the 1970s with the drug trade. I hark back to the drug trade again, because that is what changed the perspective on life so many young people. You can make that quick money. You can move out of that ghetto area. However, a lot of them simply did not, because they did not have financial management skills. And so you would have a $20,000, $30,000 car parked in the front of a shanty. You would see that very, very, very commonly, because the image was, and we also watching US television as well, and you had a reference to the diamond in the back and the sunroof top, those kind of things. Well, and you're seeing the super fly, and so you want to be like them, because hey, these guys are affluent in their eyes, and so you get into the drug trade. The gangs really arose because of, first and foremost, as I indicated earlier, in my opinion, the gangs arose primarily because of neighborhood trust. That changed. That changed when it became a trust in who could supply my financial needs, who can support, who can supply my financial needs. And so when you had the so-called drug pin that would strut around with all of these young girls on their arms, basically driving a nice car and probably living in an affluent area, then, like the old adage says, I want to be like Mike. I want to be like him. And so I want to change. However, you have to protect that interest. And unfortunately, gun violence came about trying to protect that interest. Now, when we look at society today, before there was no such thing in the Bahamas, I would say up to the 1980s, as a gated community. No such thing. But there are today. It's prevalent everywhere, primarily because, like in South Africa, I now think that there is a need to protect my interests. And so all of a sudden you have these gated areas, and therefore you have a social, political divide, because a lot of our politicians live in these gated areas as well. So there is a divide between the haves and the have-nots. We still get in this country a very strong middle class, I must say that, very, very strong. But it's becoming marginalized in that even they themselves are moving into these gated areas. I like to draw attention to the young man who wants to have affluence, who wants to present himself as being somebody to look up to. And let's say somebody coming from the ghetto. No one is going to recognize you because you have no academic credentials. You don't have the name of a prominent family. And so how do you get prominence? You get prominence by getting the money. And the way to get the money is to rob, steal, or borrow. But you're not going to borrow because nobody's going to loan you anything. You can't go to the bank, okay? Because you have no line of credit. And so you steal, or you borrow, or you sell drugs, or combine all of those factors. And how do you protect your interests? Again, I go right back. You think that you protect your interests with the gun, primarily because when you look at the movies coming out of the United States, everything is the gun. It's pure gun violence. So there is a social divide. Those who have nots that are still living primarily in the ghetto or on the fringes, and those haves that are living in their own world, totally detached from the regular person. One way that we could begin to address a problem of crime in this country, is to help people to understand what their identity is, what their history is. You have to have value in who you are. Unfortunately, that is a big task, but it has to begin from the primary schools and then come up. In fact, that has to begin from the homes. You have to have parents or guardians that are sharing these values, because the values, unfortunately, have become so very skewed, eroded. Once you have that starting in the schools, then you give the kids programs that are meaningful, that are a behavior uplifting, that will help to carve their better natures, let's say, for instance. I think that is very critical going forward. And then you continue to teach that as it go up. But you engage them in social clubs. Social clubs work. They work around the world. Trust me, they work. The old adage is that the devil finds use for idle hands. Well, you also need to empower your people by not just looking at creme de la creme, or like was said, the top 10th of your society. Let me just educate them, and everyone else is left behind. You have to bring people forward. You have to bring them along. You have to empower them. You empower them primarily also through education. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be the typical normal academic, it could be vocational. Help them to understand that manual skills have value. There is worth in it. But we did not have this culture. I have to go back to it. We never really had this culture of gun violence until after the 1970s. When the 1970s came, all of a sudden it became prevalent because the drug trade became prevalent, because marijuana coming out of Jamaica became very, very prevalent. Also cocaine coming via Colombia. And so you had people that had a pocket full of money and literally were semi-illiterate, some were almost totally illiterate, but they were looked up to as demigods, primarily because pocket full of money, driving a nice car, all the young ladies on their backs, okay, driving around with them, young girls not going to school, or going to school and sneaking out, leaving school to go off with the young men, primarily because they could supply their needs. What are the needs? The needs are when I turn on BET and the other programs that come from the United States, and I see the black culture, and I see the rap, and so forth and so on. I want to be like that. I think that's acceptable. That's the challenges that we have here. And we'll have it as long as we have these influences that will continue until the end.